Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see everybody here. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate this. On behalf of the English Department and the folklore program here at Utah State University, I want to welcome you to the 2016 Fife Honor Lecture, which is now in its 35th year. Is that my phone? My name is Lisa Gabbert. I'm an associate professor in the English department and director of the folklore program. The annual lecture is named in honor of Austin and Alta Fife, who established folklore studies and the Fife Folklore Archives here at Utah State University. Austin and Alta were a husband and wife team who pioneered the documentation and study of folklore and folk life in the American West. From the 1940s through the 1970s, this is such a romantic picture, they traveled through the summer and on weekends in their camping trailer. With recording equipment, camera, and stenographic materials in hand, they recorded and documented regional Western folk life, such as cowboy songs, Mormon folklore, and traditional vernacular architecture. 2016 marks the 50th anniversary of the Fife donation of their extensive collection to Utah State University libraries. This is an additional announcement. To honor this donation, USU Special Collections and Archives opened an exhibit today. Where's Randy? Did it open today? Yeah, opened today in conjunction with this honor lecture. The exhibit is titled 50 Years of Folk, the Austin and Alta Fife USU Folklore Legacy, 1966 through 2016. The exhibit is located on the lower level of the Merrill-Cazier Library, and I really encourage everyone to come see it. If not after the reception, then sometime in the next month, as it'll be up for about a month. So thank you for Randy for putting that together. We're very pleased to have this year's lecture delivered by Dr. Jens Lund. Jens was born in Denmark and grew up in Stamford, Connecticut. He holds a combined PhD in Folklore and American Studies from Indiana University and an MA in American Studies from Bowling Green State University. He's the author of 2 books, along with many articles and other kinds of writings. And these are The Folk Arts of Washington State and Flatheads and Spoonies, Fishing for a Living in the Ohio River Valley. And I happened to review that book when I was a graduate student at Indiana. So I don't know if you ever knew that.
No.
You should find the review.
I want to read it.
It was a good review. So anyway, Jens obviously has a long-standing interest in occupational folklore, and this is actually an area that I've become more interested in over the past year. So I'm really looking forward to his lecture. Jens has taught at 5 different universities and is nationally known as an outstanding field researcher in folklore and oral history. He's conducted fieldwork in various communities in 23 states, so that's almost half the country, and worked extensively in cultural tourism. In Washington, his home state, he developed the state's first highway audio heritage tours, and he has been director of the Washington State Folklife Council. He's developed and managed the Washington State Parks and Recreation Commission's Folk and Traditional Arts in the Parks program and has received the Ethnic Heritage Council of the Pacific Northwest Spirit of Liberty Award and is the recipient of the prestigious Benjamin J. Botkin Prize for significant lifetime achievement in public folklore. These days, he is, I don't know if fully retired or semi-retired, and lives in Olympia, Washington. The title of his talk today is I Done What I Could, Occupational Folk Poetry in the Pacific Northwest. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jens Lund.
Okay, let's get this show on the road. Whoops. Oh, okay. I've done what I could. Or I've gone to Valhalla. I've gone like a man. I've done what I could, and I did all I can. So ends a Viking funeral, a gripping tale of a down-on-his-luck North Pacific commercial fisherman in a poem by former commercial fisherman Geno Leach of Chinook, Washington. This dramatic story is told entirely in the rhymed quatrains of the ballad style. Many of us are familiar with this style through such literary poets as Rudyard Kipling and Robert Service. And you'll hear Gino recite the entire poem at the end of my talk. The dangers and difficulties of certain physically challenging occupations are sometimes expressed in the tradition of composing and reciting poems, often in the traditional ballad form of rhymed couplets. Okay, good. Best known is the cowboy poetry of the American West. The tradition also occurs among other occupational groups and can yet be found among workers in the Pacific Northwest, such as loggers, commercial fishers, and miners. Such repertoires arguably belong to the genre of folk poetry. This term has been defined by Pauline Greenhill in a 1987 article in the journal Western Folklore as locally made poetry on everyday topics meant to be read and recited. In Roger D.B. Renwick's 1980 book, English Folk Poetry, Its Structure and Meaning, the author does not offer one simple definition, but defines folk poetry in part by its content, topics and sentiments that are explicitly situated in the poet's bounded and knowable world. Although some of the topics described in the Northwest occupational poetry are hardly everyday, they are nonetheless part of a daily way of life for people in those occupations who compose, perform, and enjoy them. It is important to note that until well into the 20th century, locally composed poems of the kind usually dismissed as doggerel were regularly published in local newspapers, magazines, and trade journals. Folklorist Pauline Greenhill refers to the occasional poet who writes a poem in short order to celebrate, commemorate, or memorialize a particular occasion of importance to a community, a family, or other group of people. They are often composed in short order by a local school teacher or a librarian in commemoration of an important local event, a wedding, a funeral, a wedding anniversary. Although they'd become rare by the end of the 20th century, these occasional poems and poets were once common in the English-speaking world and elsewhere, and few literate people, especially in provincial areas, could avoid encountering them. In fact, speculation about the history of cowboy poetry almost always refers to 19th century Western newspaper and cattle industry journals. This kind of poetry is also a fine example of how, in the words of none other than Karl Marx, in an essay on Louis Napoleon's 1852 coup, he said, "The common people make their own history and do so under circumstances found, given, and transmitted from the past." It is also important to note that only a tiny percentage of loggers, fishers, miners, and ranch people have actually composed occupational poetry, which suggests that the poets themselves are extraordinary, especially the more talented ones. Before mass communication, people who worked in isolated occupations and were physically separated from the rest of humanity for long periods had to make their own entertainment. There are many examples of this. Fiddlers on ships' forecastles, cowboys packing harmonicas along the trail, a mate with a talent for memorizing and composing and reciting or singing, or some combination thereof, could be a welcome addition to the boredom during evenings in the bunkhouse or forecastle or trail camp. Several of my logger poet acquaintances remembered what they called the camp bard, whose performances they recalled from their own days in remote logging camps, and whom they recited as inspirations for their own poetic efforts. In a 1990 interview, literary poet Gary Snyder recalled hearing loggers reciting homemade poems in the logging camp where he had worked as a young man, and counted them as his inspiration to take up the pen. Narrative poetry, at least in the form of a lengthy epic, dates at least as far back as the 18th century BC epic of Gilgamesh, and probably further back into prehistory. It is, of course, also well known from the Mediterranean classical period, the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf, the Icelandic sagas and Eddas, historical epics recited by African griots. All of these are manifestations of this tradition. Many other examples abound in many places in the world. The English language ballads presented by Francis James Child in his the English and Scottish popular ballads, which are mostly of 18th and 17th century origin, and their earlier predecessors on the European continent, are much shorter than the epics, but continue the tradition of poetic storytelling. Despite the ballad-like structure of so many of their compositions, the individuals who compose contemporary fisher and logger poetry are more likely to have been exposed to rhymed couplet poetry through sources other than the child ballads. And I'll explain that a little bit later. This leads us to the topic of recitation. It seems likely that many of the logging poems that appeared in industry publications in the last 2 decades of the 20th century were never recited. The last logging camps in the lower 48 had closed by then, and radio, television, and recorded music had already taken the place of homemade entertainment. Anyway, and venues for public presentation were few and far between. On the other hand, cowboy and fisher poetry has had plenty of opportunities for public recitation, the former since 1985 at the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, and dozens of subsequent imitators. And some fisher poets had already been sharing their recitations on marine VHF radio on slow nights on the water. Perhaps because bush poet Banjo Patterson is a national hero, he made it onto the $10 bill, as you can see, in Australia, still has a tradition of men reciting bush poetry for beers in rural pubs. Eastern Washington farmer and rancher poet Dick Warwick recalled how, at least as late as the early 2000s, when he went to Australia to work on header crews, header being Aussie for combine, he witnessed it in pubs around that country's grain belt. Both logger and fisher poems have been set to music and sung often at public events. The distinction between songwriting and composing poetry is often ambiguous. In both classic epic poetry and traditional ballads were also often sung. Oregon singer, songwriter, and log truck driver Buzz Martin, who wrote and performed numerous songs about Northwest logging, and who traveled with the Johnny Cash Show, also performed and recorded several musically accompanied logging poems. And he did that in the kind of style associated with, if you're familiar with Hank Williams's Luke the Drifter recitations, in that style. And I first became interested and involved with this type of material in the summer of 1984 when I came to the state of Washington to run a small nonprofit that had been established to develop folklife programming for the Washington State Arts Commission in anticipation of that state's centennial. Shortly after my arrival, I was contacted by Hal Cannon of Salt Lake City, who was in the process of organizing the first cowboy poetry gathering, now known as the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering, which was to be held the following January. Hal enlisted me to recruit a few poets from Washington to attend the gathering. In the process of doing so, I met Harold Otto of Pateros, Washington, and he recited a poem, Cows and Logs, about a couple of eastern Washington cowboys who, having heard a logger's pay was much better than a cowboy's, traveled to the western part of the state to try their hands at that trade. A humorous sequence of mishaps then occurs, most of them based on misunderstanding of occupational terms. The two cowboys were indeed greenhorns in the logging woods. Otto told me that a similar poem from the opposite perspective, Cow Punchin' by logger Lon Minkler, which he had read in a timber industry periodical, inspired him to write Cows and Logs. Notice the two loggers trying to brand the cow there. It was my encounter with Otto and a first meeting soon afterwards with folklorist Robert Walls of Seattle, and he was then researching Northwest logger culture, and that led me to pursue logger poetry as a subject for research. And given my new job as a folklife programmer for public presentation. I soon found out that the monthly industry Logger's World, published in Chehalis, Washington, often printed poems sent in by readers. A meeting with its editor-publisher, Finley Hayes, led me to contacting loggers and loggers' wives who wrote and submitted poems to Logger's World. Having worked as event staff at the first two Elko gatherings, I then organized the first lager poetry gathering held in June 1986 as part of the Mason County Forest Festival in Shelton, Washington. Two more followed, and the Cowlitz County Historical Society organized three more at a Grange Hall near Mount St. Helens. And I had also organized other events for the Lewis County Fair in Chehalis and for the Northwest Folklife Festival in Seattle. During the first half of the 20th century, a number of folklore collectors documented so-called lumberjack ballads and published collections of them. Most of these were collected in the northeastern or upper Midwestern United States or in eastern Canada. Very little collecting, if any, was done in the Pacific Northwest or Western Canada. There are examples of logging poems and songs found in some very early publications. Lines Upon the Death of Two Young Men was published in 1815, and The Falling of the Pine in 1825. Both of them were published in English in Quebec. Almost all the logger poets I knew, most of whom were of the generation older than the contemporary Fisher poets, mentioned at one time or another they'd been required to memorize and recite poetry in public school. A few of them said they especially enjoyed this and that it led them at an early age to begin writing informal humorous verse, sometimes bawdy or scatological, and reciting it for their schoolmates. Informal conversations suggest that many, if not most, of the occupational poets I've known were exposed to some poetry in public school. They mentioned Robert Burns, Sir Walter Scott, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Rudyard Kipling. Some of the Fisher poets with whom I have had this conversation referred predictably enough to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which also happens to be my favorite poem of all time. The one poet most often cited was Robert W. Service, whose Yukon repertoire was a major inspiration. His works are familiar and uncomplicated in content, narrative style, and meter, and they have, at least in the past, been widely popular in the Pacific Northwest. Another favorite was Robert E. Swanson, a British Columbia logging and railroad engineer and a protege of Service, who wrote dozens of poems about logging and railroading in the same style as Service. A number of Swanson's poems were published in cheap chapbooks in the middle of the 20th century. Several logger and cowboy poets, excuse me, I made a mistake there. I guess I missed, several logger and cowboy poets cited Swanson's chapbooks as their inspiration. Now, regarding Fisher poetry, back around 1995, a poet friend who lived near the mouth of the Columbia River, and that's the fellow we just saw, Gino Leach, told me about it was somebody else told me about him, a commercial fisher who not only wrote poems, but also read or recited them over the Marine VHF during slack times at sea. Soon afterwards, I met Wesley Gino Leach of Chinook, Washington, who had by then left fishing and resumed his earlier career as able seaman. Gino recited some of his poems for me and gave me some copies. And he informed me that there was a move among some of the maritime folks in that region to organize a gathering of Fisher poets in nearby Astoria, Oregon. The first of these gatherings occurred in the Wet Dog Tavern in Astoria in February 1998 and was organized by Jon Broderick of Seaside, Oregon, who taught high school English and creative writing during the school year and had for many years fished Alaska waters during the summers. Broderick had brought his high school creative writing class to the previous year's Elko gathering, and he and some other local people, working with faculty members at Clatsop Community College, organized the first Fisher Poets gathering, which I then attended and have attended most of them ever since. The Fisher Poets gathering has grown into a much larger 4-day, 6-venue event, attracting poets from as far as Alaska, Hawaii, and the East and Gulf coasts. Since 2002, the Port of Seattle has sponsored an annual Stories from the Sea contest with cash prizes at Seattle's Fisherman's Terminal. and many of the contestants there are poets. And there are also ones held at the Kodiak Maritime Museum in Kodiak Maritime Museum in Kodiak, Alaska, and there's an all-women's one held in Port Townsend. Some of the better-known poets have been invited to perform at venues around the country, including the New York City People's Poetry Gathering, the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, the New Bedford, Massachusetts Working Waterfront Festival, and the Lowell, Mass Folk Festival. Mostly, though, Fisher poems are recited at smaller local commemorative occasions, private parties and dinners for maritime and fisheries-related organizations like the Oregon Seafood Association, the Columbia River Gill Netters. The local star power of a few of the poets or reciters occasionally leads to one of them walking into a local tavern for a beer and being asked by the other patrons to recite. I witnessed that a few years ago at the Fish Trap Tavern in Chinook, Washington, when Gino was asked to recite for beers. Luckily, we were within walking distance of Gino's house, so we got quite a few poems and enjoyed quite a few draft buds. At this point, you might be wondering why the phenomenon of contemporary fisher poetry mostly occurs in a limited area of the northwest coast of the United States. There are a few possible explanations for this, and it's an issue that I have raised with some of my fisher poet acquaintances. The nearby Oregon and Washington coasts and the Columbia River estuary were, until the late 20th century, very extensively fished. And as those fisheries declined, more opportunities became available in Alaska. In Alaska waters, and many fishers from the northwest coast became seasonal Alaska fishers, annually motoring north to exploit that resource. Summer season Alaska fisheries and opportunities to earn substantial pay sometimes in a single season attracted newcomers, many of them school teachers and college students who had time in the summer. Thus, a North Pacific fisher was more likely to be educated and familiar with literature, as was the case with school teacher Jon Broderick. The long distances from the west coast of the lower 48 to Alaska and the uneven openings and closings by fisheries authorities provided long periods of relative inactivity at sea, punctuated by sporadic, frantic efforts. Women also entered the profession of fishing earlier in the North Pacific, in other words, in the late 20th century. First as boat cooks, then as deckhands, ultimately as captains, perhaps because opportunities for making decent pay in Alaska waters coincided with greater mechanization of fishing equipment and with greater acceptance of women in non-traditional roles. Now, the poems. The first important point to make is that much of the poetry I've encountered among these two occupational groups, as well as among people in ranching and mining, is narrative. In other words, it's the telling of a story. The most narrative of the poems display a clear progression of exposition, rising action, climax, and denouement. Most are composed as a long sequence of rhymed couplet stanzas. Rhyming is typically AABB, AABA, or ABCB, although both the rhyme scheme and even the meter and stanza structure sometimes change when a poet finds that advantageous in advancing the narrative. The narrative and the content are the most important things. Whether or not a specific poem is a clear narrative, it almost always includes a typical repertoire of content. But there are, however, some exceptions to my generalizations about meter. Some of the fisher poets, at least, write in the more contemporary literary styles of free, unrhymed verse, although much of their content and narrative drive mirrors that of the more traditional poets. Contents of the poems deal primarily with the challenges of danger, tragedy, and adventure in one's life and work and environment. It is often powerfully emotional, and it is the emotional content, as expressed in the unfolding narrative, that makes these works so compelling. Pride, nostalgia, resentment, drama, fear, even terror are typical emotions expressed in these poems. esoteric knowledge abounds, particularly in the form of occupational jargon, but also referent to specific skills and tasks unique to their work and its tools. Mastery of a dangerous environment and of complex skills are highly esteemed and are thus major themes. On the other hand, some poems are comical and ironic. Despite the importance of the environment, many, if not most of the poems are people-centered, either in the first person or in their description of others. Vivid imagery places the listener or reader right into the narrative. Although women are among the poets and reciters, much of the content, including that composed by women, expresses experiences, values, and narrative styles traditionally associated with masculinity. In fact, I often refer to this genre as macho poetry. Although there are many women fishers up in the North Pacific, there are still very few women who actually work in the Northwest woods as loggers. I did meet one in Idaho who operated a big faller bunching machine, but mostly logger poetry by women is mostly written from the point of view of the logger's wife. So let's look at some examples. I've passed out 4 complete poems, which we'll look at last. And then at the end, we'll listen to Gino Leach recite A Viking Funeral in conclusion. Except for 2 short examples, the ones I'm going to read to you are excerpts chosen to make my points. So I'm going to read excerpts, not from the ones you have yet, but we'll get to that. In the great Northwest, I've logged with the best and camped with the bad ones too. Why anyone stayed with the logging trade, I don't think anyone knew. Soaked with rain and racked with pain, I'd drag to the bunkhouse door, then jump like hell for the morning bell and head for the woods once more. Wear your corks with pride, boy, and stag our pants legs high. We have not logged at all, boy. There's more for you to try. And when the skies turn blue and the sun shines too and the snow is melting back, I long then to blow, hit the roads I know, and leave my winter's shack. This poem, The Tramp Logger, was composed sometime in the 1980s and after his retirement by the late Otto Oya of Cathlamet, Washington. It has internal rhyme and a chorus. Its content is heavily focused on pride of work and pride in work history and physical hardship. Considering that Otto was retired when he wrote this and that the tramp logger and logging camp lifestyles had almost completely vanished, it was certainly an expression of nostalgia. I long then to blow, hit the roads I know, expresses the keen sense of adventure. Corks, referring to caulked boots, and stag, referring to cutting trousers short to keep them from tangling in the brush, characteristic inclusions of occupational jargon found in many occupational folk poems. Vivid imagery abounds in this poem and in the one following, which is from a former Rhode Island fisher, John Campbell. And he, although he's from Rhode Island, he's been a regular at the Astoria Fisher Poetry. Wind, carrying dories and oars, sailed out of the port of Gloucester, converted to the nets and doors. They cut the masts a few years back, leaving just these 2 short twigs, but you'll always know her by her lines, the last of the eastern rigs. Now these boats of steel, it seems to me, don't offer very much, and it seems to me a welded hull is always cold to touch. And I never liked those painted ladies with all their fireworks, and who could trust a vessel born amid the sparks? So I don't care if they lend me the money, because the banker never was the captain's friend. And this old boat is running smooth as honey, and there's dollars in the southwest wind. The wake she bubbles up like coffee, and we're setting out the gear. And if there is a God in heaven, she'll float another year. Last of the Eastern Rigs by John Campbell, retired fisherman, still active poet, singer, and songwriter from Exeter, Rhode Island, and longtime regular in Astoria. Vivid imagery, nostalgia for wooden watercraft, including a degree of anthropomorphism, distrust of the outside forces to whom the narrator is beholden, the banker, in this case the banker, and pride and competence. Like many of John's poems, he set that one to music and has performed it and recorded it as a song. Now here's another by Dave Densmore, and he's of Larsen Bay, Alaska, or Astoria, Oregon, depending upon the season. I'm out here on the road learning to drive a truck, because for years I just worked on deck. They say that's my tough luck. Hell, I'm not crying sour grapes, and I don't want a giveaway. But 30 years on the ocean should earn some rights, I'd say. Well, I know the laws I can't change once they're set in motion, but I just don't believe that it's a pencil pusher's ocean. Dave Densmore takes a distrust of outside forces to the degree of resentment in this poem for those on deck. Resentment is an emotion also often heard in logging poems, especially those composed after logging began to clash with environmentalism, as in the following example by Craig Jenkins of Mapleton, Oregon. Craig was part of a duo, Craig and Terry, who performed in logging communities with a band during the 1990s timber crisis, associated with shutting down the woods to protect the spotted owl. Society has turned against us now from the lies that they've been told. The press, the media, and some opinions have been so biased and bold. It makes me wonder, how did we exist? Looks like now, like the spotted owl, we've made the endangered list. Now here's another one by Densmore. I hear the rigging begin to hum, and doors and windows set to rattle, and I know that wind and sea and I will soon be locked in battle. The bow goes rocketing toward the stars, then falls off in flying spray. Once again, we're just hanging on. Can't make her pay this way. Wind is my nemesis, ocean's my home. Seems I always seek big water, no matter where I roam. I don't quite understand this trilogy we form, but it seems to be my destiny since the day that I was born. And in this poem, Wind, Densmore's pride in his seamanship, as well as questioning his own destiny, are closely tied to his choice of a working life in a difficult and dangerous environment. Now let's look at some of the women's poems. The author of the following poem, Erin Frystad, worked Alaska waters over 20 years, eventually becoming the skipper of her own fishing boat. And she's now a professor of creative writing at Goddard College's Port Townsend, Washington campus. In Advice to Women Deckhands, Frystad warns that expectations by some shipmates of women's roles continue, at least for women new to the trade. Note that it, unlike the others, is written in a literary poetic style. You will be the cook, in addition to wheel watches, working on deck, unloading fish, fueling up, filling fresh water, mending nets, grocery shopping whenever you come to town. You also will prepare 3 meals a day and 2 hearty snacks to go with coffee. You must keep the kettle on the stove full and the juice jug and 2 gallons of milk in the fridge. Another woman fisher poet, Jen Pickett of Anchorage, Alaska, writes of the physical challenges she has faced in her poem, Free. Pickett and Frystad were 2 of the North Pacific's first women owner-skippers. Getting launched from my bunk in Shelikof Strait, spend hours upon hours not sitting up straight. The ramming, the jamming, the reaming and screaming, hopes of redeeming yet another season. The cold wind, the cold water, eyes full of jellies, all this slaughter for fish for your bellies. The sore arms, sore back, sore neck, the numb hands that won't work. The moldy cheese, curdled milk, the cook is a jerk. No sleep, no rest, no fish, no money. Weeks out at sea, and no word from my honey. Logger's wife, Darcy Cunningham of Buckley, Washington, wrote these 2 short poems, Devoted and Siwashed. Okay, there's pride in her eyes, for she knows he's the best, as turn after turn he's put to the test. A kiss means so much as he goes out the door. She knows one mistake, and there won't be any more. But her smile disguises all the fears held within. She whispers, I love you, and hugs him again. Her love is made stronger as she goes on her way, just having the hope at the end of the day that he will return with a kiss that she gave and bring her the strength to face a new day. And here's Siwashed. Howdy, he says. I can just see the grin as he gives me a call to say where he's been. The guys are all thirsty, and Roz, he's here too. They yarded me in. What could I do? Timmy's arm's bending. Here comes around. I'll be home soon as we drink this one down. But I knew for sure as I hung up the phone, it'd be a while before he got home. Okay, we've passed out copies of 4 complete narrative poems. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit here. Otto Oya's Ballad of the Mount St. Helens Ape Man is a humorous narrative of 2 loggers who encounter the legendary creature and use both their toughness and their skill as loggers to prevail. It first appeared with illustrations in a 1964 issue of Chainsaw Age, an industry publication. And it is comparable to and was possibly inspired by Gail Gardner's much older cowboy poem, Sirey Pete's, or Tying a Knot in the Devil's Tail. In fact, Otto told me that when he was a little kid, he had a little record with Tying a Knot in the Devil's Tail, but he never made the connection himself. Humor, exaggeration of loggers' confident and fearless machismo, trade jargon, and tool mastery abound in this poem. The ape man has appeared on the mountainside, and everybody has fled, except for 2 there were who chose to stay and take a look around, a pair who'd never turned for home till timber hit the ground. Big One-Eyed Jim, a chainsaw man, whose name all loggers knew, for he had traveled far and wide wherever timber grew. And Slabwood Bill, a bucking fool from somewhere on the Sound, whose chainsaw roared a hungry tune, and logs did roll around. They'd take on any foe they'd meet and fight with knuckles bare. No ape man roaming logging roads could stay the famous pair. They gathered up their gas and oil and buckled on their packs, and heading up the mountainside, spit snooze upon the tracks. And then there's the confrontation, which progresses with them falling an old-growth fir onto the creature. Then Slabwood, with his chainsaw, flew with speed you seldom see. The sparks were flying from his corks as he tore down the tree. He bucked that gent from head to toe and made a long butt too. His chainsaw roared and never hung as fur and fire flew. No more the ape man roams these hills, a-hunting loggers' souls. He lies up there among the crags, up where the thunder rolls. Far different, and probably the next one in the sequence there, is The Hooker and His Lady by the late Woody Gifford of Seaview, Washington. It is a tale of love, the civilizing effect of a woman companion, danger in the logging woods, and ultimately tragedy. It is loosely based on a real incident in a logging camp where Gifford had worked as a young man. It is a consummate display of sentimentality mixed with nostalgia. And FYI, Hooker in this case refers to the rigging crew boss, also called the hook tender. The rod is the camp rod, who was in the old logging camps a messenger who relayed instructions and commands from the camp boss to the various sites. It was in the high days of the 20s on the Blue Ridge Logging Show. The rigger was pushing the outfit because the hooker was taking a blow, down in the resort city just to get away from the show. He would be back in a fortnight, all fired up and ready to go. You could see Big Dan, the hooker, his broad shoulders filling the door. Quickly he stepped down to the crosswalk between the track and the camp warehouse door. Big Dan sort of hesitated, and his face seemed kind of red. Then down stepped a well-dressed lady with a wide-brimmed hat on her head. The boys gathered round at each other, or glanced around at each other, but nary a word was said. We knew too well if we had of, Big Dan would have smote us dead. So the woman civilizes Dan, hangs curtains in the cabin, plants flowers by the door, and Dan skips the payday eve poker games because the lady is waiting for supper, and I'm going so's I won't be late. But one day tragedy strikes, and Dan is fatally injured by a falling log. The rod was coming fast like, with the lady at her side. Her face was white as death itself, and her eyes were setting wide. Big Dan was sort of drifting off, but he sensed the lady was near. He opened his eyes as she stifled a sob, and then held him fond and dear. Dan faintly smiled and tried to speak, but his words we could not hear. The end was closing in and fast. Thank God the lady was near. She seemed to freeze in that last embrace, clutching him close to her breast. So softly she spoke and kissed his brow. and then laid him back to rest. The Ride, also by Dave Densmore, and that's the long one there, recounts a near fatal shipwreck in the Bering Sea in the late fall that ended well only because of an unlikely coincidence and the brotherhood of all who go to sea. It is a tale of sheer terror. After an engine room explosion and a fire that destroyed their boat in just a few minutes, Dave and his shipmates have spent 3 days and nights without food or water in a damaged lifeboat in a blinding blizzard with enormous waves breaking over them, with one wet coat between them. The fourth night the wind eased up, and just before the dawn, I saw a set of running lights, and they were coming on. Port starboard and both range lights were aiming straight at me. So I stood up in the boarding port, the better for to see. And suddenly it dawned on me why I could see all of their lights. They were coming straight toward us, and they had us dead to rights. I started trying to rouse my crew, yelling, "Grab a paddle, we're about to be run down." They just sat there ignoring this hallucinating clown. With curses and kicks, I finally roused my engineer from his seat, but it was too damn late. We were right there at their feet. Well, Jan jumped up for the anchor flutes, and I braced for the canopy crown as that ship hit the raft and flipped it upside down. It seemed I was driven a quarter mile down in the Bering Sea. When I came up, I was under the raft. Stray lines wouldn't let me free. As I struggled to get free, one thought kept coming down. I got to get loose. This would be a hell of a time to drown. I finally got clear and burst to the top. Jan was on the overturned raft, screaming and shaking his fist at the ship as it went sliding past. After that, the story takes a turn for the better, and all are rescued by the Japanese trawler that rammed them. Even more dramatic than The Ride, although out of respect for its author, I leave it to him alone to share it. Skeeter's Song, a lengthy true account of Densmore helplessly watching his father and his son drown in waters off Kodiak Island after a boat mishap. Like The Ride and Wind, and for those on deck, Densmore unfolds that story in rhyme. And here's the key. These are primarily stories, each told for the sake of the story itself. Poetry gives them a rhythm and a structure that accentuates their dramatic element. The meter and prosody, sometimes good, sometimes fair, but they emphasize the drama of the story and thus make it all the more listenable. And now finally, we're going to listen to Gino Leach recite a Viking funeral. Again, think of my politically incorrect nickname for the genre, macho poetry. And although a man or a woman might run away from an overwhelming problem, I think I can say that the big guy's spectacular exit was, for better or worse, distinctively masculine. And the story itself, like the others we've looked at, epitomizes their poets' topics and sentiments that are explicitly situated in their bounded and knowable world. And take these 4 poems with you as examples of some of the better dramatic storytelling by Northwest occupational poets. And of course, they're all copyright the authors. So we're going to play the Viking funeral, and there's a little trigger warning here. There are a few mild vulgarities in there. So if that bothers you, you might want to go somewhere else. So I guess we can try to play it now, see if we can remember how to do this.
Well, this guy was all cargo, not flotsam or jetsam. Stood 6 football 4 in his gurried Ballard Stetson. He wore a gray Filson jacket and black Frisco jeans. They were splattered all over with Norwegian green. Well, he hiked his bulk upon a stool. I tossed a coaster down. He threw down 100, said, "Buy the house around." I rang the bell. Up went a yell from a crowd of waterfront rats. Their ship had come in. They wore beer grins and slapped each other on the back. Well, this guy was big. You know the kind. They fill up a door. He smelled like diesel fuel and stank of albacore. His face was brown as running rust, had hands like coffee cans. His wrists were like vine maple. He said, "I'll have myself a hams." Well, after 3 beers, he got up to the jukebox was howling some old Hank Williams. Then through a screen of cigarette smoke, Kodiak Chris leaned over and gave me this dope. He said I fished with that guy. He had a death wish. He fished like a drunk and drank like a fish. He's from Eureka, has a slab called Blue Star, and he blows every dime in the Vista Del Mar. Well, the big guy came back from pumping his bilge. He bought round after round with a fistful of bills. The stiffs were ecstatic. God, what a racket, when he fit 'em all out in green tavern jackets. Well, there's an hour to go before last call. He said, I'm going next door for some real alcohol. See, I drink beer for bulk and whiskey for blast. I'm going over to Red's and get drunk on my ass. He said, by the way, I got a plan. When I go out, I'm going out like a man. I ain't using no gun. I ain't using no rope. See, tuna's my game, and the bank wants my boat. Well, I just stood there. Hell, I didn't know what to think. Yeah, I let it slide. He'd had too much to drink. Well, next night at the tavern, I talked to old Pops. He worked pumping diesel at the Union Fuel dock. He said, remember that big guy that bought us all jackets? That guy from Eureka that created a racket? Well, he come in with Blue Star drunk in his ass. Got underway with 2 drums of gas. Well, 1 week later, the story came out. I got it from Larry, who'd run up from down south. The ocean was flat, they were onto the fish. They're all close to having plugged tuna trips. Well, here come Blue Star with 1 busted pole. Figured the big guy had been on a roll. He ran past the Midnight. He ran past the King. He ran past the Trojan and past the Doreen. He kept on a running way out to the west. Blue Star disappeared into a red-orange sunset. Well, out on the horizon, they saw a bright light. It glowed for hours well into the night. At daybreak, they found her, but they weren't in time. Blue Star had burned to her waterline. Well, all they found was a note and a quart bottle of hams, and here's what was printed in a block-lettered hand. I'm gone to Valhalla. I went like a man. I done what I could. I did all I can.
That's it. Thanks. I'm not sure what the story is with regards to question and answer. Whether we're going to do that from here or... Okay, so I'm ready to take questions. Yes?
Would you gloss the first stanza of that for me?
Would I what?
Norwegian green.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's, Jon
I know
Broderick,
Filson.
pardon me?
I know Filson.
Yeah, no, Norwegian green, snooze,
And
splat.
Gurry Ballard.
Oh, a Ballard Stetson is a cap
And what's
worn
Gurry?
by, it's got nothing to do with Stetsons. That's
What's
a,
Gurry?
Gurry is fish, old fish guts and blood.
I wish I had an answer.
And yeah, that's what it is. And
What's Norwegian green?
Norwegian green is snooze,
This way?
snooze,
Chewing tobacco.
yeah,
Oh, I thought that
or
was
snuff. Maybe it is. It's probably, it's American and they call it Copenhagen. So I guess it's supposed to be Danish. But that's what he's calling it here. But the Ballard Stetson is a folk costume. It's worn by longshoremen and deckhands and as well as fishermen. It's a little cap, usually homemade, and it doesn't have a button on the top because something hit it. And they just call them that because they wear them in Ballard. On the East Coast, they call them Lundberg Stetsons because Harry Lundberg of the Seamen's Union wore them, and I think they're also, there's another name they have for them, but that's what that is. Any other questions? Yes?
I knew nothing about occupational poetry an hour ago, so thank you for teaching me something today.
Okay.
In my ignorance, I was casting around for points of reference, and I kept thinking of Carl Sandburg and kind of dismissing it because he writes such a very different kind of poetry. But then one of the poems that you read had a reference to painted ladies, which reminded me of the line in Sandburg's Chicago about
Right.
painted women. And did he ever come up as an influence? On
No,
these?
I've never heard him. And of course, he's talking about ships, not
Right.
humans.
Sure.
So, no, I've never heard him mentioned at all. Other questions? Yes?
Does anyone ever take the poems and turn them into songs since they would fit so nicely
Yes.
with people that
Well,
have
two of the ones that I read for you have been, three actually. The Ballad of the Mount St. Helens Ape Man, which I've actually committed to memory as a song. That was set to, when he was still, when he wrote that, he was still logging. And he lived in Detroit, Oregon. And a neighbor of his, who was a high school music teacher, set it to music, and they got somebody to actually record a demo of it. So there exists a rare demo of somebody singing that. The one about the Last of the Eastern Rigs, that's on an LP, probably a CD now, by John Campbell. And what was the other? There's another one on there that, oh yeah, Craig and Terry's Endangered Species. It looks like now, like the spotted owl. That was set to music. So yeah, a lot of them are, and Jon Broderick in particular, he recites some, but he probably sets more of them to music than he does recite them. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how often they get political in their poems, and do they? I know the spotted owl came up in a lot of poems around that time. And
Yeah.
what else? What sorts of political? Do they use it? You know.
It usually has to do with regulation. You know, the resentment of, well, pencil pusher's ocean, I mentioned. That's usually what comes up. I'd say it's relatively rare, but you know, if you were to go to the Fisher Poets Gathering, you'd probably hear a few poems that had some kind of political element to them, but only politics directly. I've never heard anything other than directly related to the occupation. And of course, the women's poems, you know, the personal is political, have to do with women's roles and expectations. There was a great one about that I encountered also by the one Jen Pickett, in which she talks about having to sleep with the captain in order to keep her job, you know, and how unpleasant that was. So yeah, in the political as personal or as directly related to their own experiences, yes. But I have yet to hear any that are political in the broader sense. Yes?
How much exposure did the kids of the next generation after this have to the poems?
Well, a lot of the, as I said, the logging poetry recitation tradition is pretty much moribund. But a lot of the Fisher poets, not all of them, but a lot of them are family people, and
Do they go to the schools?
they go to the events. They can't go to the particular venues that have, you know, that are in the bars, but they go to some of the other venues. Yeah, and I know that Broderick's, at least one of Broderick's sons has had a hand, you know, has done some writing and reciting. The logger poetry of the generation of my parents and grandparents, the Fisher poets are largely the generation, I wouldn't say the generation of our kids, but although some of them are, you know, kids in the 30s and 40s, that is, but I would say most of them are of a generation that's maybe 10 years younger than I am or so. So they're not quite, they might have young kids or young adults or adolescents or whatever. So yeah, they are exposed to it and they do come to some of these things. But to what extent they're taking it up or not, that's a good question. And that's a question that they ask themselves at the people who organize the Astoria, you know, the gathering in Astoria. And it's certainly a question they ask themselves at the Western Folklife Center in Elko with regards to the cowboy poetry gathering. Because in order to have a tradition, you've got to be able to sustain it. On another question, yes?
Do you have any perspectives to give us on it's called the issue of literary poets versus, I don't mean the word versus, but in comparison with folk poets? Can you draw a line? I notice a lot of these people are pretty hard to pin down.
Well, there are some, certainly there are literary poets who write stories, set them to, again, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, it would be a perfect example of that. But it's pretty unusual, I think, to find literary, there are some like Philip Levine, for instance, who do, but most of the literary poets of more contemporary ones are not so much telling a story. They're not using the poetic devices to advance a story that has, as I said, exposition, rising action, climax, and denouement. And although not all these poets do, all these poems do, I would say the majority of them do. Some of the, well, Aaron Freistad would be an example of someone who really straddles both of those traditions. And Gino Leach has actually written some material that's more kind of descriptive of a situation or of an emotion, and that are not in the rhyme couplet style. But that's really the big distinction that I see. And then also a literary poet, I guess the biggest distinction is a literary poet is trying to create a poem that is, by its structure and form and all that, a work, an artistic expression. Occupational poet is trying to tell a story and use the structure, use the prosody or whatever to advance the story. So there's really, I think, are two different goals. Both of them are trying to express themselves, but one of them is trying to tell you a very specific story. This is what happened, or this is what's happening. At least that's the way I see it. Yeah.
Well, that actually, maybe that answers the question, but my question was, why that particular structure has remained so popular among various kinds of occupations, because, it's cowboy poetry, it's loggers, it's been, oil riggers, so is that because that particular scheme is useful for advancing narratives as opposed to, other kinds, or why has that always been among traditional occupational poets, the scheme that they use?
Two things. One, it is useful for advancing narratives, because then you can go on and then, and then, and then, and then. And second, it's accessible. You don't have to try to imagine how stuff is going to fit together, as a literary poet does. Well, how am I going to fit this together in an artistic way without, a clear, simple pattern like you find in rhymed couplets? So I think those are the two reasons that I see.
I would add one more, and I think it is, certainly in cowboy poetry, the ability to memorize. It is accessible in the sense that they can remember the poem without a written copy. Now that's changed a lot, over the years, but I think there's still that part of it.
Yes, absolutely. That is a very good observation. And Elaine is the editor of that book I showed, Cowboy Poets.
Dave was the primary.
Dave and Elaine are the co-editors of that book, which incidentally has a chapter in it written by me about cows and logs, about cowboys and loggers trading poems about each other's occupations, ironic poems about each other's occupations. So get that book and read it. Someone else? Okay, I guess we're ready to try some.
Thank you very much, Julianne.